I've said before that the Wolfman really does. He's the in terms of the Wolfman as we know him today. It's a relatively recent development or evolution of this monster archetype, because the Wolfman film that really started, the first one to really kind of iconically get it right in major culture, wasn't until 1941, 10 years after Universal started making these classic movies, Dracula and Frankenstein and so forth. And when we were trying to locate each of these archetypes in a literary masterpiece, obviously Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we looked at Jekyll and Hyde, and we talked about that because that's where this begins. This look at the duality of man. Now, the werewolf story in general obviously predated all of that. Where the werewolf finds his foundations, it's even earlier than the vampire. Werewolf trials were going on with witch trials long before there were even vampire stories, in folklore. um, the original idea of the werewolf, though, like when werewolf trials and whatnot, was basically the same thing as a witch in a lot of ways. These were individuals who had made some sort of pact with the devil in order to gain this power to become a wolf, or they were given a special, Peter Staub, the famous werewolf trial, one of them of the day anyway, admitted or confessed to making a deal with Satan, and Satan gave him this special wolf belt that he could put on and become a wolf, and he was glorying in killing his relatives and our neighbors and whatnot, eating them, just massacring them and so forth. You have the beast of Gevaudan, if we're pronouncing that correctly, probably not, but stories of just monstrous wolves, preying on villages and whatnot. And there are all kinds of thoughts about that. Was it a rabid wolf? Was it just a hungry wolf pack? Was it a hyena that somehow escaped, some sort of circus or whatever? There are all kinds of stories. So certainly our modern idea of the werewolf or the wolfman definitely draws from these most early, these earliest encounters. Like the idea of silver, as far back as I can plant it or trace it, is the Beast of Gevaudan in France, because the guy who claims to have killed the beast and stuffed it, put it on display and so forth, claims to have used a silver bullet. Well, why silver, right? And I think that comes from the idea of the werewolves being the same as sort of witch trials. How would you execute a witch or a werewolf in that respect? They would burn them till death. They would burn them alive in most of the cases, in the earliest instances anyway. And, these are, medieval Catholic villages. Fire has the connotation of purgation, right? You think about purgatory. The idea of purgatory in Catholicism isn't nailed down. There's a lot of artistic depictions of it, but nowhere does the Catholic Church even say this is exactly what purgatory is. All the doctrine of purgatory is, it comes from Paul, I think in Corinthians, maybe, if I forget the right letter, but he's talking about how our works will be tried one day. Our works will pass through fire. So purgatory isn't the same as hell, right? Hell is punishment, but purgatory is a place of flame, even if it's just metaphorical flame, by which your works are passed through. So if your works were true and your works were truly trying to please God and so forth, then it's like gold passing through fire purifies the impurities of it, and it comes out shining even more brightly. But if your works are like wood, then they'll be consumed, and you're still saved. You're saved if you're saved, but you lose those rewards. Like all of your works are just burned up, and you're as one who has just escaped through fire, Paul says. And that's where the doctrine of purgatory comes from. But there's that idea of purgation, with fire. And that's why fire has also survived as a secondary way to kill werewolves. Certainly a lot of werewolf stories, it makes physical sense too. If you consume, with flame, all the physics of the body, what's there to reincarnate or shapeshift or whatever. So fire or silver. Now, the reason silver, going back to my original point there, silver is a very pure metal. It doesn't tolerate impurities well. Silver was also used in a lot of holy implements, silver crosses and silver crucifixes and whatnot blessed. And a lot of the stories will have them making silver bullets out of like blessed crucifixes and so forth. So silver is another way of a purgation, you know. Now, why is that so applicable to the werewolf as opposed to like the vampire or something? Because the werewolf is a human, right? The vampire, even in the earliest uh, folklore tellings of the vampire, they were reincarnated corpses. You know, they were ghouls. They were no longer human. But the werewolf, even taking wolf form, is still a human who has made this horrible choice. In the classic stories, in the classic werewolf trials and so forth, is a human who's decided to make this pact with the devil or whatever. So there's a purgation that is needed there, and that's the only way to kill them. You know, it makes sense. You know, silver, fire, whatever. As I mentioned before, when Bram Stoker's writing Dracula, he's looking at folkloric traditions and tales of vampires and all this stuff. And Dracula is a werewolf. He's a vampire, but he also changes into a wolf. There's Wolf's Bane, you know, the novel talks about. I think the novel talks about that. Certainly, there's aspects of this. There's the fact that the eyebrows are supposed to grow together, and that's a sign of the werewolf. Hairy palms, you know, when Harker goes to meet Dracula, he's described his hair coming out of his, you know, sleeve onto his palm. That was a sign that you were a werewolf back in the day and so forth. So Dracula, you know, as he was originally written, was even written with werewolf attributes as well. But that classic werewolf really doesn't go into the duality of man and the struggle within man. It's just a man who's chosen the wrong side, a man who chooses evil. Jekyll and Hyde was not in any way intended to be a werewolf story, and it's not. It's not today, but it's the first literary work or masterpiece to really, really investigate the duality of man. And we talked about this when we talked about the work, especially with Robert Louis Stevenson coming from the Scottish Presbyterian background, the Scottish Calvinist background, and the idea of two natures. This is an innately Christian idea that we have two natures within us, and that we must feed one and starve the other, or starve one and feed the other. You know, and certainly the Scottish Presbyterian or Scottish Calvinist idea was a very specific one, but that basic idea, you know, without the Calvinist trappings, is present in any Christian denomination or religion. And it's interesting to see how I think there were lots of werewolf stories. I would argue that the first one to truly grapple with any depth the idea of trying to struggle with the wolf within yourself, I would say, was Guy Endor's Werewolf of Paris. There were other stories. There's a really cool little short story. I think it's the first English speaking language or English language short story of a werewolf. I think it's just called Werewolf. I forget the author's name, but and they reflect sort of the loup-garou or rougarou idea, the French idea of a werewolf who isn't taking their Christianity seriously, isn't celebrating Lent properly, or something like that, and they allow the beast within them to grow. You know, it's sort of the Catholic Molinist idea of the two natures within you. But Guy Endor's Werewolf of Paris wasn't published until the 20s, I think early 20s. And Guy Endor was actually a writer for Universal Studios. He was a writer in Hollywood. Ironically, no one really tried to adapt his movie or his novel into a movie until like 1961's Curse of the Werewolf from Hammer Horror. But I do think that a lot of people, whether they'll admit it or not, in Hollywood were taking from his novel the idea of the struggle within, the internal struggle. Because in the 30s, Universal they made Werewolf of Paris. And you should watch Werewolf of Paris. It's a great movie. Henry Hull was a wonderful actor. He did a great job. It's got, what's her name? The woman who played Elizabeth in Bride of Frankenstein. I keep wanting to say Evelyn Ankers, but that's the leading lady in Wolfman. I can't remember her name right now, but she was, you know, the leading lady in Werewolf of London, and it was really more of a Jekyll and Hyde type story. Really, he's a plant, a biologist or a plant. What's the word? I forget the name for the plant specialist. So he's not a chemist or doctor in that sense, but he's a plant scientist, and he's somebody who lets his work consume him so that he neglects his wife and neglects his everyday life and neglects his human side, his human trait. And we see the botanist. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was the name, but the word botanist. But we see the consequences of that, especially with going out to search for this one plant, that only responds to the full moon in certain ways. This is where the idea of the moon started to kind of play into it a little bit. So, but Henry Hull's character was not very sympathetic. He was facing the consequences that were kind of due to him. He was kind of a jerk, honestly. We never really get, and it's not Henry Hull's fault. He's just playing the character that was written there. But his character isn't somebody that you're like, oh man, I really feel sorry for that guy. He's kind of a jerk. He's kind of getting what he deserves to a certain extent. Now, before I go into the difference between the 40s Lon Chaney's Wolfman, let's talk about the idea of were creatures in general, because I think some people, when they talk about, or you'll see videos or documentaries where they try and talk about the Wolfman, they get lost in the weeds a little bit when they're trying to define the origins, or they're just going back into ancient history, and they'll talk about, oh, well, the Epic of Gilgamesh, had a man who was changing into a creature, or they'll talk about King Lycan or Lycaon from Greek mythology and so forth. Then they'll talk about where cheetahs or where panthers or where monkeys from different cultures and different whatnot. And yeah, all of that's linked to the extent that it's the idea is man coming to terms with his wild self, with his more animalistic self. Mankind is different than animals, right? We have a sense of sentient being. We have memory. We have a sense of right and wrong and so forth. So man is different than the animals, and yet there's so many likenesses between us and animals in our physical bodies and whatnot. So what do we do with that tension, that duality? And so, yeah, those kind of things always would take place in different cultures, and certainly with different animals, depending on what animals were the biggest threat to that culture, right? So cheetahs in Africa or whatever, you can imagine that would obviously be more applicable to ancient native Africans than a werewolf idea, where cheetah certainly would be. So why is wolf the one that's come to really just encapsulate that archetype for us today? Well, it has to do with a lot of reasons. For one, that we're Western culture, which comes from Greece and Europe and so forth. And the wolf was the biggest. It was hardly, wolves are hardly the most dangerous predators out there by any means. You might think, shouldn't a were-gorilla or a were-tiger be even more powerful than a wolf? But wolves were the most direct threat to a civilized village. Wolves were the ones that would come around the village and feed on the lambs, or maybe grab your small children out there, and stuff. So wolves were something that was a constant threat, a constant present threat that the Europeans certainly had to deal with. Certainly even the first settlers of the United States. Wolves have been beaten back. I mean, wolves were native to the whole eastern coast of the United States, but they were basically done away with, extinct here, in certain areas. Now they're being brought back in some places in the Midwest and whatnot. But they were present there as well, and a real danger and a real threat. They do work in teams, so they work in pack mentalities and hunt together. So they're very dangerous, very cunning. I also think, though, that wolves are a great symbol, and they're a better symbol than any other animal, of the capabilities of being domesticated versus still having a wildness in you, right? Because at some point, somewhere, somebody had to domesticate a wolf, and that's eventually how we get our dogs, our household pets, our dogs. So the idea that a wolf would, there's a capability of domesticity within the wolf, and a capability of really true savage, wildness in the wolf. So I think they're just a great image. They're a better image of any other wild animal for this archetype. They're the greatest fit, I think, and that's why they've stayed. What makes Lon Chaney Jr.'s The Wolfman, 1941 The Wolfman, such a classic, though, is that this was the first time in Hollywood or even I think in a widely dispersed storytelling manner, because Guy Endor's novel had been out there, but it wasn't like a worldwide bestseller by any means. But Lon Chaney's Wolfman brought the same kind of pathos that Universal Studios gave to like Frankenstein's monster. They brought that same kind of pathos to the victim of being a werewolf. And that's owed to Kurt Siodmak's script. That's owed to Lon Chaney Jr.'s, wonderful portrayal of the character, as well as George Wagner's direction. I mean, The Wolfman really is an amazingly classic film. It's not a perfect story. There are some holes here and there, but it's such a classic movie because we don't see any behavior in Lawrence Talbot that would make him deserve this type of curse. We see him being a little bit, I'm going to use this word, and I think they would have meant this word, wolfish. You were considered a wolf back in the day if you were hounding women or catcalling women, or just a wolf out there just trying to get as many women as you could, or whatever. That was the word for you. He's not really that by any means, but we do see him pretty aggressively. We see him pursue Evelyn Anchor's character quite a bit, even though he knows she's supposed to be betrothed to marry someone else. He's like, he's not here now. You're not married yet, So we do see that little bit of a wolfishness in him in that respect, but he does nothing to deserve bearing this mark. In fact, he is cursed with the werewolf curse, to be redundant there, by trying to save a woman that this other werewolf is preying on. Bela Lugosi's, wolf is preying on this woman and kills her, but he's trying to save the woman, and in the process, he gets bit. So that's the real, I think, fascination, pathos, and I think real terror of the Wolfman. And I'm gonna have to explain this because I don't think modern audiences really get this. And I'll explain why I think that is and everything in a second. But this is the real terror of the werewolf. There was a 50s film called Werewolf. It was kind of one of those sort of drive-in, 50s movies, but it's actually really quite good. It's not like a B-level film at all. It came out 1 year before I Was a Teenage Werewolf with Michael Landon, which is also another really good exploration of this. Those movies in the 50s, this was the atomic age at that point. So the cause of the werewolf, disease, disorder, whatever you wanted to call it, was usually due to science, due to some sort of mad scientist trying to revert man to their primal state, or trying to beat the radiation poisoning that was surely looming over us all with the atomic weapons and whatnot. But there's one point in the werewolf movie from 56, I think it is. I might have that wrong. But they catch the werewolf, and the people are sort of celebrating at this bar. But I think it's one of the sheriff deputies said they're not celebrating. They're scared, and they're trying to overcome that fear. And the woman he's talking to is like, what do you mean? Everything's fine. He says, no, they're scared. And I know what they're scared of. They're scared because now they know it happened. And if it happened to this guy, then it could happen to them. And that's the terrifying thing, that it could happen to you. Facing the darkness within you, facing the wolf within you, is the real terror of a werewolf story. That's what makes Lawrence Talbot's character so tragic and fun to follow, is the fact that, oh my gosh, that's in me. That wolf, that evil, that capacity, that potential for that kind of violence and terror and evil is within me. And if you don't think that's the case, then you're absolutely lying to yourself. Even as far back as the Kurt Siodmak's original script, they were trying to go, for the psychology of it. And there's a lot of great talks about the shadow self and the evil within man, the duality of man. And if you deny it, if you just utterly repress your shadow, it will come out almost like a werewolf, And on the one hand, people don't. In a lot of classic werewolf stories, some of the evils are some of the ways that a character might cross the line a little bit, moving towards their inner wolf, are social norms that really aren't practiced anymore in today's society. like going out and being crazy licentious, trying to get, as much sex as you can or whatever, or trying to, um, do a lot of different things, violence wise, sex wise, or whatever, that we just, they're not social taboos anymore because we've tried to, we've pulled so far away from religion for our main culture. So on the one hand, we've normalized a lot of the things that the classic werewolf story would paint as your inner wolf. So the modern audience doesn't even recognize that as wolfish. On the other hand, though, we live in a society today where people are 100% dual natured, straight up evil little villains. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, how many of you have an anonymous screen name for online platforms? And not that, just having an anonymous screen name doesn't mean you're evil by any means, but what freedom does that anonymity give you in an online space? Think of some of the evil, and I mean straight up evil behavior you've seen people exhibit, hiding behind an anonymous screen name. You can just look at that, anonymous screen name they have as their wolf. And they are horrible to people. And I know anybody a YouTube creator knows because you've gotten comments like this. These are people that are exhibiting just the most despicable sides of human nature. And people who get online bullied, for example. People do all kinds of things online and they let that inner shadow self fly all over the place because they don't feel like they'll get any consequences for it. It's kind of like Jekyll and Hyde, right? Jekyll wanted to create this formula so that Jekyll wouldn't have any of the consequences that Hyde, would face. It was two different people, it's two different natures, How many people live online like that? That might sound like I'm being a little um, hyperbolic, but I'm not. I mean, how we are so much an online culture today, and certainly not everybody does this, but you got that little identity there with a nice firm mask, and no one knows it's you. And think of just the despicable things that people do today. So on the one hand, even though we've sort of normalized a lot of social taboos that play into the classic werewolf story, on the other hand, we desperately need tales that show us a good reflection of the consequences of the evils within us. This is one of the things that our technology does. It just removes so many of the consequences. You think about children, psychologists and whatnot saying that as they grow up, they don't have a lot of the social skills that generations before them had because they grew up online or in online settings where they didn't have to face. They could say anything they wanted about a person, and they don't see the pain on the person's face that their words evoke. So they're like, yeah, that felt good. Whatever, I'll do that again. Um, so it's interesting. We don't really have good modern. I think that's why we don't have really good modern werewolf stories. Now, that's not to say that great werewolf stories stopped in the 50s. Of course not. Of course not. As I said, The Curse of the Werewolf, 1961. I have an image from The Howling on the thumbnail. Howling is a great. It's not really so much based on the books. The books were fun, but the movies really just went a completely different way. But they really did delve into this psychology, and of your baser self, and they were great explorations of that. Um, I wouldn't, one thing about it's ironic that wolves are the perfect symbolic animal to embody this archetype because wolves are pack animals, but the werewolf doesn't really work well in a pack scenario. I know it's been done. I know like the Howling, sort of has an idea of it there, but even in a story like that, it doesn't really work. The wolf as your inner basic primal, instinct, it these are not team players. These are not, family members. Your inner basic shadow self isn't somebody that's going to play well with others. It's different in something like Underworld. I love Underworld, but that's Underworld's never ever tried to be a vampire story or a werewolf story. Underworld is a mafia family fight story. It just happens to be lichens versus vampires as opposed to, the Italian mafia versus the such and such mafia or whatever. It says Dracula is evil, Frankenstein is victim, werewolf is unique for being both evil and victim. Yeah. And that's the human condition, right? That's the human condition. I wouldn't call humans innately evil. A Calvinist certainly would, believing in the total depravity of man. We talked about that for the Jekyll and Hyde book. But that man has the capability for both evil and good, and yet at the same time is sort of an innate victim. I mean, even from a Christian um, worldview, born with a sin nature, in need of salvation, and yet did we ask to be born with a sin nature? We didn't eat the apple, for crying out loud. That was Adam. That was Eve. So these stories are wonderful explorations of that, and of the pathos and anxieties over that.